I couldn't listen to him bullshit, so I never went and drank with him to socialize. But everybody was just separated, and this booking committee thing was just a bunch of, who knows?
He has no guts. Those are words that should never be spoken about Ric Flair. Because if there is one man in the history of professional wrestling who always had guts, who always had heart, who always had the will to fight no matter what came at him, it was the Nature Boy. Ric Flair is one of the most important people this sport has ever produced. That is not up for debate. That is not an opinion anyone can take away. That is backed up by 5 full decades of work that no one else in this business could come close to matching. He held the world title 16 times. 16! He traveled from city to city and country to country for years and years, carrying this sport on his back when nobody else had the strength to do it. He worked when he was hurt. He worked when he was exhausted. He worked when other men would have packed their bags, gone home, and never looked back. And he did all of it while somehow looking like the most glamorous person who had ever walked through an arena door. The robes that cost more than most people made in a month, the bleached blonde hair that every fan could spot from a mile away, the slow, deliberate walk that told you something special was about to happen, the woo that echoed through every building he ever entered. There was never anyone like him. There will never be anyone like him again. When fans try to picture what a world champion is supposed to look like, how a world champion is supposed to carry himself and speak and move, they picture Ric Flair. He created that image. He set the standard. He raised the bar so high that most people could never even see the top of it. For decade after decade, he was the measuring stick that every young wrestler was judged against. You wanted to know if someone was truly ready to be at the top of this business? You put them in the ring with Ric Flair. If they could keep up with him, they had a real future ahead of them. If they could not, they needed more time and more work. That was the level he operated at. That was the deep respect he earned everywhere he went. That is who Ric Flair was, a performer who made every arena feel like the most important place on earth the moment he walked in. A man who could take any crowd, anywhere in the world, and have them fully in his hands within minutes. Fans who saw him live never forgot it. Parents brought their children to arenas just to watch him perform because they knew they were watching something rare. His matches were not just athletic competition. They were moments that people carried with them for the rest of their lives. What you are about to hear will make you angry. These betrayals came from bosses, rivals, and partners who shared his own locker room. Each one tried to take something away from him. Each one walked away having failed, and every single attempt only added one more chapter to the legend of Ric Flair. But there is a side to him that does not always make it into the tribute videos. There is a chapter that keeps getting left out of the highlight reels. The truth is that Ric Flair was betrayed. Not once, not twice. 8 separate times, people he worked with and trusted made choices that hurt him badly. Bosses tried to destroy his identity from the inside out. Now, former colleagues worked to steal the spotlight he had earned through decades of sacrifice. Men he thought were old friends slowly became bitter enemies. Legal threats were used as weapons against him by people whose careers he had helped build. His greatest partnerships were mocked on live national television by people who had no right to do it. And through every single one of these betrayals, the Nature Boy kept moving forward. He kept showing up. He kept performing. He refused to be finished. Today, we are counting down all 8 of these betrayals in full. We are starting at number 8 and going all the way down to number 1. And by the time we reach the very end, you will understand exactly why Ric Flair is not just a legend. He is the toughest, most unbreakable survivor this business has ever produced. Number 8 on this list is a man who never wrestled a single day in his life. He never laced up a pair of boots. He never felt what it was like to stand in front of thousands of people waiting to be entertained. He had never taken a bump or learned to read a crowd or understood the fragile and complicated trust between a performer and his audience. Before he arrived at WCW, Jim Herd had spent his career working in corporate food service. He was an executive at Pizza Hut. In Turner Broadcasting, the massive company that owned WCW at the time, decided that this man was the right person to run a professional wrestling promotion. That single decision set the stage for one of the worst betrayals Ric Flair ever experienced. When Herd arrived at WCW in the late 1980s, the company was struggling to keep pace with Vince McMahon in the WWF. McMahon had turned professional wrestling into a loud and colorful spectacle full of larger-than-life characters. Herd believed the only way WCW could compete was to completely copy that approach. So he looked at his roster and started figuring out which performers could be overhauled to fit his new vision. He looked at Ric Flair and decided there was a serious problem. To Herd, Flair was getting getting old. He was a leftover from a different era. He was not the kind of exaggerated personality that could match what the WWF was putting on television. So Herd came up with a proposal that still makes wrestling fans shake their heads in disbelief today. He wanted Ric Flair to cut off his famous bleached blonde hair. He wanted Flair to start wearing a diamond earring. And he wanted Ric Flair, the man known everywhere on earth as the Nature Boy, to change his name entirely and go by Spartacus. That is not a joke or an exaggeration. The man who had spent over a decade traveling every corner of the globe as one of the most recognized names in the entire sport was being told he needed to become Spartacus. One person inside WCW compared this idea to going to Yankee Stadium and changing Babe Ruth's number. It was that wildly disconnected from reality. It showed in the most painful way possible how little Jim Herd understood about what Ric Flair actually meant to this sport and to the millions of fans who had followed him. Flair refused. He was not going to let someone walk in off the street and erase everything he had spent his entire life building. His hair, his name, and his persona were not cosmetic details that could be switched out for something newer. They were his identity. They were the things that made people open their wallets and buy tickets to watch him. And Jim Herd had no understanding of that at all. But the creative destruction was only the beginning of the betrayal. Things escalated sharply when money became involved. In 1991, Herd told Flair he needed to accept a significant pay cut and step back from the top of the card. This was the company's biggest earner for years on end. This was the performer who had carried the NWA World Heavyweight Championship across the entire globe and elevated every territory he had visited. And Herd wanted to pay him less while pushing someone else into the spotlight. Herd also wanted Flair to drop the title to Lex Luger, but Flair had already made a prior agreement that the championship would go to Sting first, and he was not going to break that commitment. Herd fired him on July 1st, 1991. The biggest star in WCW history was suddenly without a job, but the betrayal was still not over. Under the rules of the NWA, a champion was required to post a $25,000 deposit when he received the belt. This existed to prevent a champion from leaving and taking the title to a rival. By the time Flair was fired, that deposit had grown to around $38,000 with interest. Flair was owed all of that money back. Herd refused to return it. He held on to the deposit and would not give the money back to the man he had just let go. Flair responded the only way that made sense. If WCW was not going to honor what they owed him, then he was keeping the belt. He called Vince McMahon and walked out onto WWF television with the WCW championship draped over his shoulder. It became one of the most embarrassing moments in WCW history. Their former champion was on the rival show, holding their own title up for the world to see. At the Great American Bash pay-per-view, Flair was absent. The crowd was furious. The replacement title match used a modified tag team belt with the words World Champion written on tape and pressed across the front, taped on. That is the direct result of Jim Herd refusing to return a deposit he owed. Herd was never equipped to lead a wrestling company. He had one of the most recognized stars in the entire sport and treated him like a problem instead of an asset. Flair was right to protect himself when the company refused to. That is number 8. Number 7 is a very different kind of betrayal. Jim Herd was simply ignorant about the wrestling business and did not understand what he was dealing with. But Eric Bischoff understood perfectly. He knew exactly what he was doing at every step of the way. And that is what made his betrayal so much more personal and so much harder to accept. By 1998, Bischoff had built WCW into a genuine rival of the WWF. He was smart and calculating, and he knew how to manufacture controversy that kept people talking and watching. But when it came to Ric Flair, Bischoff used all of that intelligence to punish and humiliate a man who had devoted decades of his life to that company. On April 9th, 1998, Ric Flair missed a WCW Thunder taping. The reason was completely understandable. His son Reed was competing in an amateur wrestling tournament. Flair had given WCW advance notice that he would not be there. While he was not sneaking away, he was not being difficult or disrespectful. He was a father watching his child compete. Bischoff chose to use that as a weapon. He filed a lawsuit against Flair claiming breach of contract. At the same time, he attempted to legally stop Flair from working for any other wrestling company while simultaneously keeping him off WCW television entirely. Bischoff was constructing a trap. Flair could not appear on WCW programming. He could not go work anywhere else either. He was being forced to sit at home and wait, penalized for attending his own son's sporting event. This was not a calculated business move. It was deliberate cruelty dressed up in legal paperwork, and Bischoff was not finished. He used WCW's live television platform to go after Flair personally in front of the whole country. Well, he went on camera during broadcasts and described Flair as a piece of excrement stuck to the bottom of his boot. He said these things with cameras rolling and fans watching at home in every market WCW could reach. For a man who had built his entire career around being the most respected respected name in the sport, this public degradation was an attack on everything he had stood for. His reputation was being damaged in real time by the person who was supposed to be leading the company forward. The situation came very close to a permanent breaking point during the Unforgiven pay-per-view in Greensboro, North Carolina. Flair was reportedly in his car, circling the outside of the arena. He was speaking with his personal lawyer and with Jim Cornette. Vince McMahon was reportedly ready to have Flair walk into the front row of a WWF event as a clear signal to the entire world that the Nature Boy had changed sides. That is exactly how close it came. Flair's legal team advised him not to do it because it would hurt their settlement position, so he stayed in the parking area. The lawsuit was settled in September of 1998. When Flair returned to WCW television, he delivered one of the most famous promos in wrestling history. It was completely unscripted. He stood in front of the crowd and spoke about abuse of power. He was emotional. He was shaking. Every word came from a place of genuine pain. The people watching could feel that something very real was happening in that ring. That promo has lasted for decades because of exactly that authenticity. Herb Bischoff and Flair later appeared together on screen, and there was even a storyline where Flair won the on-screen WCW presidency. But the damage from that lawsuit left marks that never fully healed. Bischoff had built his reputation on being smarter than everyone in the room. Against Ric Flair, he used that intelligence to crush someone who dared challenge him rather than improve the company. That is what made his actions indefensible. What made his behavior even harder to accept was that Flair had done nothing to deserve it. He had shown up, worked hard, and drawn money for that company for years. The moment he put his family first on one single occasion, the full weight of the company came down against him. That is number 7. Number 6 is the most complicated relationship on this entire list. Ric Flair and Dusty Rhodes were two of the most important figures in the history of this sport. On screen, their rivalry was legendary. They sold out arenas all across the country for years. Fans drove from far away to watch them clash. The matches they had together produced some of the most powerful storytelling professional wrestling has ever offered. But behind the curtain, something very different was taking place between them. Dusty Rhodes served as the head booker for Jim Crockett Promotions, the company that ran the NWA during that era. As booker, Dusty had final authority over every match outcome and the direction of every storyline across the entire promotion. Flair believed that Dusty consistently used that position to protect his own image rather than what was best for the championship or the performers working around him. And the main problem was something wrestling fans still recognize by name: the Dusty finish. This was a booking trick Dusty used repeatedly throughout their rivalry. The structure was always similar. A major match would happen. Dusty would win the world championship from Flair in front of a roaring crowd. Fans would erupt, and then very quickly the result would be overturned. A referee had made an error. A rule had been broken. The title change was reversed and officially declared void. The 1985 Starrcade gave one very clear example, where Dusty appeared to take the title from Flair, only for referee Tommy Young to reverse the decision shortly after. Dusty also used a masked character called the Midnight Rider to win the title in non-televised matches, with those victories also being reversed after the fact. From Flair's perspective, this constant pattern of false title changes was slowly draining the prestige from the championship he had given so much to protect. His whole purpose as world champion was to make that belt feel important. Every city he flew to, every arena he worked, every match he competed in was meant to make that championship seem like the most valuable prize in the sport. Every reversed finish Dusty booked stripped a piece of that value away. It made fans feel cheated and manipulated. It damaged the very thing Flair was putting his body on the line to represent. The championship was the center of everything professional wrestling built itself around. It was the reason fans bought tickets. It was the reason young wrestlers trained until they could barely stand. Dusty understood its importance better than most. Hanada, that is what made his choice to treat it carelessly so hard to forgive. The worst moment came in late 1988. Dusty, still the booker, scheduled a match for Starrcade 1988. Rick Steiner was booked to defeat Ric Flair for the NWA World title inside a cage in 6 minutes. Steiner was talented, but he had not built the credibility needed to carry the company's most important championship. Flair believed this was a direct attempt to embarrass him and push him toward the exit before Ted Turner completed his purchase of the promotion. Jim Herd and an advisor named Larry Matisik stepped in and changed the booking. The main event was rescheduled as a match between Flair and Lex Luger. Dusty was eventually taken out of the booking role, but the attempt had been made and Flair had seen it clearly. When he now understood that the man controlling his matches was willing to use the championship as a weapon for his own personal interests. Looking back, Dusty could have used his booker role to genuinely build the company in meaningful ways. Instead, he chose to protect his own image. Flair paid the price for that choice. Dusty Rhodes was one of the most gifted personalities this business ever produced. On screen, almost nobody nobody could match him. But behind the booking desk, he too often treated the title as something personal rather than something that belonged to the entire sport and the entire industry. That is why Dusty Rhodes is number 6. Number 5 is the man most fans would recognize as the other greatest icon of that generation, Hulk Hogan. When Hogan arrived in WCW in 1994, he did not come as just another wrestler looking for a fresh start. He came with creative control written directly into his contract. He had real influence over how he was presented on television. He could steer storylines in his direction. He could affect the people around him in ways that virtually no other performer in the history of the sport had ever been able to. And Ric Flair has said very directly that Hogan used every single piece of that power to push him away from the position he had spent his entire career building. Before Hogan arrived, Flair was the foundation of WCW. He had been there almost from the beginning. He had carried the championship around the world. He had given the company credibility and prestige when it needed both most. But from the moment Hogan walked through the door, the entire focus of WCW shifted toward him. Every main event moved in Hogan's direction. Every major storyline was built around his presence. And Ric Flair, who had been the defining star of that promotion for years, found himself being pushed further and further down the card with each passing month. When the New World Order formed in 1996, the situation became even more painful. The NWO was the hottest act in all of professional wrestling. Hogan stood right at the center of everything it did. Randy Savage and Sting were also given prominent positions. And Ric Flair, the man who had built the very company the NWO was now taking over, found himself described as an afterthought. He was losing matches to Hogan without much difficulty or resistance. He was also being booked to take clean losses against mid-card NWO members who had nowhere near his level of history or contribution to making WCW what it was. Flair has spoken plainly over the years about what he saw happening backstage. He has said that Hogan used his creative control to block involvement in storylines and refused match outcomes that would have helped the company grow and thrive over the long term. There is an unwritten code in professional wrestling. The biggest name in the company is expected to help build the next generation of stars. You take losses when those losses help someone else rise. You do what is best for the health of the entire business rather than just protecting your own position. Hogan, in Flair's telling, rejected that code completely and without regret. And he protected himself at the top regardless of what the cost was for everyone else around him. Flair has spoken about this period of his career with real honesty in interviews over the years. He was not just frustrated with how he was being booked. He felt genuinely erased, like everything he had sacrificed and contributed to build WCW was being ignored by someone who simply did not care about any of it. The years from 1996 through 1998 are described by Flair as the absolute worst of his professional life. The changes inside WCW left him struggling to find his confidence and his sense of who he was inside the company he had helped create from nearly nothing. That internal struggle became so real and so consuming that it eventually inspired an on-screen storyline where Flair's character suffered a visible and complete mental breakdown. The real pain he was carrying from real life had crossed directly over onto television. Hogan never fired Ric Flair. He never sued him or called him names in public, but he used his power to make the Nature Boy feel like an unwanted guest in the house the Nature Boy had built with his own hands. That is why Hogan is number 5. Number 4 is the saddest story on this entire list. This was not a corporate executive who failed to understand wrestling. This was not a rival from another company looking to steal ground. This was someone who was supposed to be a true brother in the business. Arn Anderson was one of the founding members of the Four Horsemen. He and Ric Flair were part of one of the most iconic groups in the entire history of professional wrestling. They had stood side by side. They had represented something together that fans still speak about with real affection decades later. But beneath the surface of that bond, something corrosive had been building for a very long time. Arn Anderson believed in a hard and physically grounded style above all else. He had no patience for anything theatrical or flashy. He valued toughness and realism in a narrow and uncompromising way. And he held Flair's entire approach in contempt that he made no real effort to conceal. He criticized Flair's bumping style as too exaggerated. He dismissed the Nature Boy persona as too reliant on showmanship and performance. He made sure the people around him understood that he had little professional respect for the way Flair chose to work. Rather than keeping those views private, Ole voiced them regularly. At one point, he reportedly suggested that Flair should be given the NWA World Championship, primarily because holding the the title would require constant travel from territory to territory across the country. The champion's schedule was brutal and demanding. Ole's actual reasoning was that if Flair was always on the road, he would be out of Ole's territory in Georgia, and Ole would not have to deal with him. He wanted Flair gone from his daily professional environment so badly that he proposed handing Flair the most important prize in the entire sport, just to keep him at a distance. Flair has described Ole over the years as a man who became consumed by bitterness because the wrestling business evolved and moved past him. As the sport changed and different styles grew in popularity, Ole's approach became less central to what drew fans and made money. Now, instead of finding a way to adapt and stay relevant, Ole directed that frustration outward toward the people who had thrived by doing things differently. Ole also played a role in one of WCW's most embarrassing creative disasters. In 1990, the mysterious Black Scorpion angle ran for months without any satisfying resolution and left fans deeply confused and frustrated. Ole had reportedly pitched the concept as a joke during a creative meeting, never intending it to be taken seriously. Jim Herd ran with the idea anyway, and the whole angle became a source of real embarrassment that Flair had to work through without any coherent direction. Ole Anderson chose bitterness when he could have chosen gratitude. He was part of something genuinely historic and enduring when he helped build a group that wrestling fans across multiple generations still remember with deep affection, and he could never bring himself to appreciate what that meant. In 2012, the Four Horsemen were inducted into the WWE Hall of Fame. For wrestling fans everywhere, it was long overdue recognition. Ole Anderson refused to attend. For Ric Flair, that absence was the final act of betrayal from someone who had once been a partner. The ceremony was a chance to honor something real they had created together. Ole walked away from it. Their relationship was never repaired. Ole passed away in February of 2024, and the distance between him and Flair had been permanent long before that final day. Some rifts are too deep to close. The one between Ric Flair and Ole Anderson was one of them. That is why Ole Anderson is number 4. Number 3 is a conflict that never once took place in a wrestling ring. It was a war fought through the pages of published memoirs and the words of public interviews that went back and forth between them for close to 30 years. Ric Flair and Bret Hart were two of the finest technical wrestlers this sport has ever produced. Both men gave everything they had to mastering their craft. Both could step into the ring with virtually anyone and produce something worth watching. Both cared deeply and genuinely about what professional wrestling was supposed to represent, but for the better part of 3 decades, they saved very little of that professional respect for each other. The public portion of their conflict started when both men released their memoirs. Flair published his book first and used it to question Bret Hart's ability to draw paying audiences as a world champion. He was not careful or measured with his words. He called Hart a pissant in the context of wrestling history. He also made the pointed observation that if Hart had truly been a genuine draw, Vince McMahon would not have let him leave for WCW in 1997 without putting up more of a fight to keep him. Hart responded with equal force and directness. He described Flair as a routine performer who had worked the same match every single night for 30 years and never found any reason to change or grow as a performer. He went specifically after Flair's knife-edge chop and called it lazy work that inflicted real pain on an opponent without contributing anything meaningful to the story happening between the ropes. Hart's entire philosophy centered on the idea that great professional wrestling should look completely real without actually causing genuine harm to your opponent. Flair's harder and more physical old-school style ran directly against that idea. To Hart, causing real pain was not evidence of toughness. It was evidence of a performer who had stopped investing in genuine craft. These exchanges stung Flair deeply because he had made a real investment in Hart's career during their earlier years together. In 1992, when Flair was working for the WWF, he worked a match against Hart in Saskatoon, where Hart won his very first WWF championship. The event was not televised nationally, and the audience was not enormous. But Flair was making a deliberate choice to put a younger performer over in a meaningful way. He was doing what experienced veterans are supposed to do. He was helping someone get to the next level. To have Hart later dismiss his entire 4-decade career as routine felt like a direct rejection of that professional investment and generosity. The irony in their conflict is that both men were actually right about what they cared most about. Both had genuine love for professional wrestling. Both were committed to their own version of what the sport should be at its best. They simply could not see the value in each other's approach until it was very late. In recent years, the relationship between them has shifted towards something much better. Flair has said publicly that he and Hart have reconnected and now consider each other friends. He has acknowledged that the wrestling business turns people against each other in ways that are not always honest or fair. Hart has offered similar words. Both seem to have found real peace. Wrestling often pushes people apart who should be celebrating what they share. Both men deserved more mutual respect than either was willing to give. The sport lost so something real in all those years of conflict. But for close to 30 years, the words between them were sharp and deeply felt. That is why Bret Hart is number 3. Number 2 began with 4 words printed in a book and ended with a real punch connecting in a cafeteria hallway. Ric Flair and Mick Foley developed a genuine and lasting personal dislike for each other that became one of the most discussed backstage incidents in wrestling history. And it all started with the phrase glorified stuntman. In his 2004 autobiography, Ric Flair wrote about Mick Foley in the most dismissive terms he could find. He wrote that in his honest professional view, Foley was not a great worker. He could not punch, he could not kick, he could not perform the fundamental technical skills that Flair had spent a lifetime mastering. What Foley could do, in Flair's telling, was absorb extraordinary punishment and fall from great heights and land in horrible ways that other people refused to attempt. His popularity was built entirely on extreme physical sacrifice, rather than on any genuine wrestling ability or craft. For Mick Foley, reading those words was a painful and very personal experience. Foley had spent his entire career tearing his body apart to give audiences moments they would never forget. Yet he had lost his right ear during a match in Germany. He had been thrown from the top of a steel cage. He had absorbed the kind of sustained physical damage that would have ended most careers many times over. He believed he had genuinely earned the respect of his peers through all of that sacrifice. To have Flair reduce all of it to stunt work rather than wrestling was a cut that went extremely deep. It should also be said that Foley had not been gentle with Flair in his own published work. He had criticized Flair's record as a booker in WCW and wrote that Flair was every bit as poor at running creative as he was gifted inside the ring itself. The mutual disrespect had been building on both sides long before they ever came face to face. On December 13, 2004, Foley arrived at an event at the Von Braun Center. He found Flair and approached him with a copy of his book intended for a charity auction. Flair extended his hand in greeting. Foley refused to take it. He turned the handshake down outright in front of people who were watching. That refusal was more than Flair could absorb calmly. He threw a punch that connected with Foley's face. A heated and very loud argument followed immediately. Flair challenged Foley to continue the confrontation right then and right there. Foley responded that Flair was a 55-year-old man who was simply not worth the legal consequences. They went separate ways that day with nothing resolved between them. In 2006, Flair and Foley built a feud that drew directly from their authentic bad feeling toward each other. It ended at SummerSlam in an I Quit match that saw Flair press a barbed wire bat against Foley in one of the most physically intense bouts either man had ever competed in. Peace eventually came between them. Both have spoken generously about the other in later years and acknowledged what each contributed to the history of the business. They found their way to common ground that neither might have predicted. But on the night Foley refused that handshake and the Nature Boy threw that punch, the years of real disrespect between them became completely and publicly undeniable. That is why Mick Foley is number 2. Number 1 belongs to 2 men, Scott Hall and Kevin Nash, the outsiders. The men who helped build the New World Order and change professional wrestling in ways that echoed through the sport for years after they arrived. To Ric Flair, their arrival in WCW in 1996 was not simply a shift in the balance of power inside one company. It was a deliberate attack on the values and traditions that Flair had spent his entire career defending and protecting. When Hall and Nash came to WCW, they arrived with enormous creative freedom backed by Hulk Hogan's political influence and the goodwill of the front office. They could essentially do whatever they chose to do, and what they chose was to position themselves as the thrilling future of professional wrestling while making the people who had actually built the business look like forgotten relics that nobody needed to acknowledge anymore. Flair believes firmly that Hall and Nash used their power to deliberately dismantle the credibility and standing of the Four Horsemen. The NWO was constructed to be the most exciting act in the entire sport. Making that work required making everyone else look like they belonged to a chapter that was already over and forgotten. Hall and Nash framed themselves as the direction the industry was heading. They framed the Four Horsemen as something from the distant past that fans had no reason to care about. This was not an accident. It was a deliberate and calculated decision made with full awareness of what it would cost the people around them. By turning the villains into the most beloved figures on the show, Hall and Nash broke one of professional wrestling's most fundamental principles. The business runs on the structure of heroes and villains. Fans need to believe the bad guys can be beaten. When the bad guys become the most popular people in the building, it becomes almost impossible for anyone else to build a meaningful connection with the audience or generate real interest. Flair believed that Hall and Nash understood exactly what they were destroying and chose to proceed anyway. Hall and Nash did not just change WCW, they changed the way professional wrestling thought about itself. And not in a way that helped the people who had spent their lives building the sport. The NWO era turned legends into relics, critics. That is something Ric Flair never fully forgave. But the single moment that Flair found most unforgivable did not directly involve him at all. It involved his closest partner in the entire wrestling business. On September 1st, 1997, just 1 week after Arn Anderson had delivered one of the most heartfelt and genuine retirement speeches in wrestling history, the NWO turned that sacred moment into a live television parody. Anderson had been forced to retire permanently due to a serious neck injury. The speech he gave the week before was not scripted or rehearsed. It was a real man saying a real goodbye to the career and the life he had built over decades of hard work. Fans watching at home understood they were witnessing something raw and deeply painful. 1 week later, Kevin Nash appeared on Nitro wearing a bald wig and a neck brace. He portrayed Anderson as a stumbling and pathetic drunk who could barely hold himself upright. Sean Waltman wore a fake blonde wig and a prosthetic nose to mock Ric Flair's mannerisms alongside him on camera. They turned a real man's real injury and real career ending into a comedy segment broadcast to a national television audience. Ric Flair was devastated by what he saw. He called the segment tasteless. He believed it was a calculated attempt to strip away whatever dignity and credibility the Four Horsemen still had in the eyes of the viewing audience. He was furious that WCW management allowed the segment to air at all without stopping it, or their failure to step in was a betrayal of the trust of everyone in that locker room. Nash later offered an apology, but some actions reach a place where an apology cannot fully pull them back from. Arn Anderson has spoken openly about the way that parody affected his family in real and lasting ways. It was not about wrestling angles or television ratings or promotional battles. It was a public mockery of a real man's genuine physical suffering shown to millions of people without any consideration for the human being at the center of it. That mark does not disappear with time. That is why Scott Hall and Kevin Nash are #1, not only for what they did to Ric Flair, but for what they did to Arn Anderson, and for the disrespect they showed toward the sport that Ric Flair had spent his entire life protecting and representing. So those are the 8 betrayals. 8 people who turned on Ric Flair across the span of a career that most people will never fully understand. 8 separate moments of broken trust, broken promises, and broken faith. But here is the part that matters most when all of it is taken together. Ric Flair survived every single one of them. He did not simply endure them. He outlasted every person on this list. Jim Herd tried to erase his identity, and Flair walked straight onto WWF television carrying their championship belt on his shoulder. Eric Bischoff tried to destroy him through the legal system, and Flair came back to deliver one of the most raw and emotionally powerful moments in television history. Dusty Rhodes tried to damage the championship and force him toward the exit, and the whole plan collapsed before it could be carried out. The Hulk Hogan used his backstage power to push the Nature Boy to the side in his own company, and Flair kept showing up and kept performing at the highest level he knew. Ole Anderson turned bitter and cold and refused to share in the recognition of what they had built together, and Flair honored that legacy regardless. Bret Hart dismissed his entire body of work as routine and unoriginal, and Flair is still considered one of the greatest professional wrestlers who ever competed in this sport. Mick Foley called him a glorified stuntman, and they went on to share one of the most talked about matches in SummerSlam history, and Scott Hall and Kevin Nash mocked everything he stood for on live television in front of the entire country. And the Four Horsemen still stand as one of the most important and celebrated factions ever created in this business. Ric Flair had bosses trying to rename him. He had legal action filed against him for attending his own son's event. He had the people he called brothers become cold strangers. When he had the company he helped build turn away from him while he was still inside it working every single week. And through every bit of it, the Nature Boy kept his hair. He kept his name. He kept his robe. He kept his walk. He kept his woo. Because he knew something that none of the people on this list ever fully understood. You cannot stop someone who has already decided in their own heart that they will not be stopped. You cannot break something that has committed to never breaking. Ric Flair did not become a legend because his career went according to plan. He became a legend because almost nothing went according to plan, and he refused to let any of it stop him from being exactly who he was. Every betrayal on this list is not a record of failure or weakness. Every single one is a record of everything the Nature Boy had to overcome to hold on to what was rightfully his, and he held on to it every single time. His legacy stands unchanged. His name is permanent. The Nature Boy is still standing after all of it, and that will never change.